One of the external ways we can corroborate a claim, especially a claim of antiquity, is simply, for example, to look at the archaeological evidence, right? They're making claims, for example, about the Gospels make claims about what happened in a particular region of the Roman Empire in a particular century. Well, then we should have some claims about the geography or the characters or the structure of government or just the cities that are mentioned. And if you were to look at the claims of, say, for example, the Book of Mormon and compare them to the claims of the New Testament, you would find a stark contrast. That 1,000-year history in the Book of Mormon between, say, 600 BC and 400 AD, you won't find any archaeological support for any of those claims. Any of the people groups that were said to be there, a single name from the Book of Mormon ever mentioned by any historical character, allegedly. You will not find any support for a city, any support for coin systems. Well, a lot of folks, thought the same thing of the New Testament. There was skepticism in the 17th, 18th, 19th century about whether or not Luke, for example, was recording anything accurately in the book of Acts. So I want to show you a list, just a brief survey of some of the some of the claims, rather, of the New Testament made by either John or Luke. Most of them here are made by Luke, a couple here by John. But I want you to see these are claims that people doubted, as written by the authors of the New Testament. Now, ultimately, archaeology has confirmed these claims. So where we had skepticism, we ultimately now have confirmation. And you will see this over and over again in the claims made by New Testament authors that were originally doubted, but later confirmed. Now, I'm constantly updating my list, and I have this written at our website at coldcasechristianity.com, but also the 10th anniversary edition of Cold Case will includes, for example, a number of new archaeological finds that continue to verify the claims of the New Testament. By the way, if there was a Mormon scholar who could point to these kinds of verifications for the Book of Mormon, they certainly would. There just isn't anything, because those, you should expect something. By the way, I don't expect every detail of the New Testament to be confirmed by archaeology. This is a discipline of fractions. But I would expect some confirmation. So I don't expect there to be every detail of the Book of Mormon to be confirmed, for example, but there should be some confirmation. And the fact that there is none should tell us something. So what else beyond the external confirmation of, say, archaeology could we point to verify or corroborate claims in the New Testament? Well, there are some internal corroboration, some internal evidences we could look at. And one of the things I often talk about is the unintentional eyewitness support that any two witnesses might give to support each other in a case. In other words, I often will have an interview where I'll interview one witness, and that person will tell me something that's confusing. I'll take notes. I will write down what they said, but they'll leave out some detail. For whatever reason, they'll make a claim that doesn't seem to make any sense. So let me give you an example of this. We talked to one witness after a robbery, a bank robbery, and this witness says something like this. The suspect just walked up to the teller, and he just stood there in front of the teller. And it was weird because he just stood there. Didn't hear him say anything. And I'm not sure why, but she just looked like she was scared to death. And it seemed like almost for no reason at all, she just started giving him money. That seems odd, right? So this witness comes in, and based on what this witness is telling us, I have an open question. The question I would have is, okay, so why would she just start giving him this money? Like what would cause her to be so afraid that she would just give him money? Well, if you keep on interviewing eyewitnesses, this eyewitness may have been standing behind the suspect in line. There's another eyewitness standing to the side. And that eyewitness, when interviewed, gives us a detail that's interesting. This eyewitness says, yeah, he came up to the counter. This is like a coworker, right? She's standing there next to the teller, and she sees that this guy's going to walk up, and it turns out he handed her a note. And this witness says, yeah, I could see there was some kind of a bulge under his jacket that seemed like the tip was pointed to her. Oh, so what's happening here is he's given her a demand note, and he's pointing what appears to be a gun or a weapon of some sort that they can't see that's under. Maybe he even says something in the demand note. Now this makes sense. I can insert this piece of information from the secondary witness, who, although they may not even know what the first witness said, They provide a piece of information that answers a questionable or a seemingly hard to understand facet of the first eyewitness account. This is what I call unintentional eyewitness support. You see this if you ever read a series of supplemental reports from eyewitnesses. You will often see that one eyewitness will say something that kind of raises a question, only to be answered if you keep reading through the reports and you listen to what everyone has to say. Well, something similar, this is, by the way, a key feature of reliable eyewitness testimony, even though it may raise a question, this kind of eyewitness support you get unintentionally from other eyewitnesses does buttress the reliability of the account. Well, this kind of happens in Scripture too, right? So if you turn to the pages of Scripture, you will see that you'll sometimes see an account that seems to raise a question. By the way, I have been reading through the Gospels again, and I see more and more of these. Someday, I think I'll just do a book that just outlines all of them, because I don't think there's one source right now that covers all of this. But I do mention this quite a bit in a whole section of Cold Case Christianity. So you'll see that one eyewitness will say, Jesus is standing at the council being under trial. And at one point, they spit in his face and they beat him with their fists and they slap him. And someone who's doing this to Jesus says, kind of mocking him, "Oh, you say you're the Christ? Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who was the one who hit you?" Well, that seems to me to raise a kind of curious question. Okay, you're standing right in front of me and you're slapping me in the face. You're beating me with your fists, and then you want me to identify who's doing this? Okay, what would be so hard about just saying, "Hey, it's you, you moron. You're standing right in front of me"? How would that be considered prophecy if I could simply identify the person who's standing right in front of me? Well, it turns out there's another eyewitness account of this. This is the first one I gave you, is from Matthew. But in Luke, it's revealed that the people who were holding Jesus in custody and were mocking him had already blindfolded him. So this makes sense now, although it makes no sense in Matthew, because nowhere in Matthew does it say he was blindfolded. Well, Luke gives us the piece that makes sense of the account in Matthew. In other words, in a similar way to the first, we are able to insert this and make sense of the account. One account unintentionally supports another. I'll give you another example of this from Matthew. It says that when Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw that Peter's mother-in-law, was lying sick in bed with a fever. And it's interesting that everyone sees that what's going to happen. They all know Jesus is a miracle worker. He can heal. But it's interesting that not until evening comes does everyone bring demon-possessed and people who are broken and need healing. Suddenly he's barraged with people, and he's able to heal them. I mean, doesn't that strike you as odd that he wouldn't just heal Peter's mom, then go on and heal everybody? Like what is going on? Why is there a delay? That's the question that seems to be raised. Okay, why is it that whatever time he got to maybe he gets to Peter's house late? I don't know, but the question still remains: why is it that Jesus waits until evening to heal everyone else? Well, Mark tells us, because in Mark's account, he says that when they came into that city, Peter's hometown, they entered on the Sabbath and began to teach. That means that they're not going to heal anymore and people aren't going to think they could be healed because it's the Sabbath. They start coming to him at the end of the Sabbath. So in other words, Mark inserts an account that makes sense of the missing detail. Let me give you just one more. It says in Matthew's gospel also that at the time that Herod, the tetrarch, heard the news about Jesus, he starts to question his servants. Then he says to the servants, "This is John the Baptist. He's risen from the dead. And that's why this miraculous power is at work in him." Okay, well, why would you remember that when the king has questions, he usually calls his advisors? Yet he's having this conversation, not with his advisors. He's having this conversation with his servants. A king asking these important questions about Jesus and John to not his advisors who would know something about the Messiah and about John, but instead to his servants. Doesn't that seem odd to you? It seems to raise a question for me. Why would Herod be talking to his servants about such things? Well, we know this answer is provided by Luke. Luke tells us that it was the servants, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who were contributing. Guess what? These were followers of Jesus. they were actually contributing to the ministry of Jesus. And Herod must have known enough about that to be able to say, look, you know this guy. Now, we wouldn't know that from Matthew's account, but Luke, again, provides us that unintentional eyewitness support. So even internally, this kind of thing helps us to have confidence that you have puzzling eyewitness accounts, which is always the nature of eyewitness accounts. We puzzle them together, filling in the blanks for each other, providing the details that solve the mysteries of one or another account. There's another piece of internal evidence I want to show you also that corroborates a lot of the authenticity and reliability of the New Testament accounts. And you will see that, for example, in the kind of regional depictions and names that are, this is the region around which Jesus had his ministry. And I've actually dipped into Egypt here for a reason, because if you compare this region that is biblical up here on the top right with the region of Egypt, here's what you would discover. If you knew anything about the language and the names and the kinds of cities that exist in these two regions, you would know this. If we've done some work on this, I talk about it in Cold Case Christianity. There's a work that's been done on just examining what are the most popular men's and women's names in each region when it comes to Jewish people who are living in Egypt or Jewish people who are living around Jerusalem. It turns out that the most popular names in Egypt for Jewish men are these names. Now, you may recognize one or two of these, but that's about it, because these are not the most popular names in the first century for Jewish men in the area around Jerusalem. These are the most popular names. Well, now that makes sense, right? It turns out that the most popular names that are used in the first century around Jerusalem happen to appear on the pages of the New Testament. And interestingly, if you were writing this account from Egypt, you wouldn't know. So the Gnostic Gospels written from Egypt, they wouldn't have known what the most popular names were, right? In other words, it turns out that one of them, and I'll give you another example of this. So it just turns out that the documents written in the region of Jerusalem happen to get the names correctly. Not only that, to compare, for example, in Egypt, these Gnostic Gospels. If you read those Gnostic Gospels, this is what you're going to discover. You're going to discover that the major cities are described for sure. So you'll see the city of Jerusalem is often the main city ever described by any gospel author of the Gnostic Gospels. Interestingly, though, all of the minor cities appear in the New Testament. And why is that the case? Well, because let's face it, all of the minor cities were known to the authors who actually were writing from the region in which these events occurred. The people who were writing in Egypt and making up stories about Jesus just didn't know enough. They may have known a few names of his disciples. They may have known a few of the cities, but they weren't familiar with all of the details of the region around Jerusalem to be able to repeat it with the kind of clarity and the kind of accuracy that the gospel authors were, because the gospel authors actually knew the region because they're writing early in history from the region. But let me go to another type of evidence that is often used. And I want to look at evidence that's not in the scriptures and not from archaeology. This would also be considered an external evidence, right? And that is when you have another eyewitness who can say something, or another person who can say something maybe even a generation later that at least confirms that you've been telling that story consistently without changing it. And so, for example, we have a number of non-Christian ancient voices that appear in history. Now, I've done some work on this in both two books, a little bit here in Cold Case Christianity and a bunch in Person of Interest. But I want to show you that you can actually reconstruct the story of Jesus if you just had pagan sources. And I want to stay with the pagan sources that appear closest to the first century. Remember, we like that first century range because you've got a better chance that someone is still alive who would know the truth, even if they were a young child when Jesus lived and saw Jesus's ministry as a child, let's say. They would still be alive to know if these kinds of sources were saying something accurate. So I want to look at non-Christian sources early in history, like Thallus, for example, who is quoted by Julius Africanus, who Thallus is going to make a claim here that during the crucifixion, that there was an earthquake and there was darkness, just as the scriptures report. But Thallus is going to argue, according to Julius Africanus, that this is not because of anything divine. This is not God's response to the crucifixion. This was simply an eclipse. Now, that's what he's going to argue. Thallus, now non-Christian, is going to say that, yep, that was not divine. That was just an eclipse. Well, in order to say it was just an eclipse, you have to admit certain things. Let me give it to you this way. If somebody ran into a bank and did a bank robbery, and then later I interviewed that person who did the robbery, and I said, dude, I know you were in that bank. Oh, I was not in that bank. Okay, I've got video of you in the bank. Now, I'm actually not telling the truth about that. I don't have any video, but I'm just going to tell him I do and see what he says. Well, okay, I was in the bank, but I was in the bank just to make a deposit. Really? Well, I can see you went over to the teller and lost your temper at the teller window. Oh, I was just angry because she wanted my identification. That's why I ran out to go get my ID. Now, look, he has not confessed to doing the robbery, but he has made certain admissible admissions, right? These are called reluctant admissions. He's told me he's in the bank at the time of the robbery. He's told me he confronted the teller for some reason. He's just changing why he did it. But those reluctant admissions will be used in court because those are the kinds of things that at least place him in the bank at the time of the robbery, doing everything that other witnesses are going to say was part of the bank robbery. Well, it turns out Thallus here has made several reluctant admissions. In order to claim that the darkness at the crucifixion was just an eclipse of the sun, you'd have to be able to first admit reluctantly that Jesus was an historical character who really lived and was crucified, and there was an earthquake and darkness at the crucifixion, even though you claim it's from some other source, it's from the eclipse. You've reluctantly given us these pieces of information, and you're starting to corroborate the story of the Gospels. Tacitus, for example, will say that in order to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt. This is the report of a fire that was caused by, during Nero's reign in Rome. Nero afterwards blamed that fire on Christians. It says he inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So look, this is somebody who's not an eyewitness to the claims of the Gospels, but he does tell us that there was a person named Jesus, reluctantly he admits, who was called the Christ and who lived in Judea and was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And apparently the followers of this man, Jesus, were Christus in this case, were persecuted. Mar Serapion, who's a Syrian philosopher, also reluctantly admits, and I'm trying to stay as close as I can in time. I'm not giving you 3rd and 4th century non-Christian sources here. I'm giving you the earliest sources that are writing in a period of time in which there would likely be survivors who would know if this was true. Mar Serapion is saying something to his son. He's teaching his son about important philosophers of the past. He mentions, for example, what did the benefit did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death, right? Famine and plague came over them as a judgment for their crime, or the people of Samos for burning Pythagoras. In one moment, their country was covered with sand, or the Jews. Oh, interestingly, for what? For murdering their wise king. After that, their kingdom, remember in 70 AD, the Jerusalem is attacked and the temple is destroyed. God rightly avenged these men, the wise king living on in the teachings that he actually provided. So here you have someone calling Jesus a wise king, and that claiming that the Jews somehow, at least tangentially, were involved or responsible for his death. Phlegon, who's quoted by Origen, makes a couple of claims here. Based on the 13th or 14th book, Origen is saying, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, but also testified that the result of these predictions came true. They actually corresponded to what was being predicted. And that while he was alive, he wasn't able to save himself, but arose after death. In other words, and he's been pierced by nails, showing these signs. Now think about that. That means that this is a source that confirms reluctantly a few other details. Now, just take a look for a second at this list in red here. This is everything that could be known about Jesus if you just surveyed the earliest non-Christian sources who recite what they know about Christianity. So you would know something about Jesus even if you lost every bit of the New Testament just from non-Christian voices in the first century. I just want you to see what that list looks like. These are the reluctant admissions of non-Christians.